Hi guys, welcome to Joshua's Tech Tips. In this video, we're going to take a look at Domain Name Services or DNS. So here we have a guy who only speaks English. This other guy, he only speaks Spanish. So if they both attempted to communicate, it won't be possible since they both only speak their native languages. In this scenario, we'll need an interpreter or a translator. Similarly, as humans, we primarily communicate using words. This is our primary language. Computers on the internet, however, they primarily communicate using numbers or IP addresses. That's where DNS comes in. DNS translates or resolves our human language words to IP addresses and vice versa. So for example, once someone enters google.com in their web browser, remember, computers communicate by IP addresses and not words. So their computer will need to find out the IP address of google.com before they can communicate. So what happens is your computer, through the process of DNS, is able to get the IP address of google.com. So in this example, the IP address of google.com is 8.8.8.8. So once DNS provides your computer with the IP address of google.com, then communication would be able to take place. So let's look at this in more detail. When a user types in google.com into their web browser, the computer would first look at its cache memory to see if it previously searched for google.com. If the computer does not have that information in its cache memory, it would forward the request to something called a resolver server. A resolver server could be your ISP, for example, with your internet service provider. So once this request is forwarded to a resolver server, it's basically asking the resolver server, do you have the IP address for google.com? The resolver server would then look at its local cache. If the resolver server had previously queried this request before, it would have a copy in its local cache. However, for this example, we are assuming it does not have a copy of it in its local cache. The resolver server would then forward this request to something called the root server. So the root server sits at the top of the DNS hierarchy. The root server will not specifically know what is the IP address of google.com, but it would be able to point us to the TLD server or the top level domain server, which is responsible for the .com domain. So it would provide the resolver server with the information for the TLD server. The resolver server would store this information in cache. It would forward the request next to the TLD server. So TLD or top level domain servers are responsible for, as you could guess, the top level domains. So this would be, for instance, .com, .net, .org, etc. So we are particularly asking the .com TLD server if it has the IP address for google.com. The TLD server would not specifically know the IP address for google.com. However, it would have information for the authoritative name servers for google.com, and it would provide us with that information. The resolver server again would store this information in cache and forward the request to the authoritative name servers. So the authoritative name servers have the final say, as they are responsible primarily for this domain. So once the resolver server asks the authoritative name servers, do you have the IP address for google.com? The authoritative server would respond, yes, I do have the IP address for google.com. It will then provide us with the IP address for google.com. In this case, it's 8.8.8.8. The resolver server will now store a copy of this in its cache. So for future reference, if it's asked for the IP address for google.com, it would not necessarily need to go through this entire process since the information would be stored in its local cache. The resolver server will now pass this information along to the user's computer who initiated this query. the user computer will now be able to access and communicate with Google.com through its IP address, and through this process we call DNS. Also, the user's computer will store a copy of this information in cache, so for future reference, it will not necessarily need to go through this entire DNS process. It would simply look up the information in its local cache. And that brings us to the end of this video, guys. I hope you have a little better understanding of what DNS does. Also, be sure to like and share this video. And if you like the content I'm creating, be sure to subscribe to my YouTube channel and click on the notification bell to be notified once a new video is released. Thanks again for viewing. See you soon.